Hello, I'm John Hager with Activism is Medicine, and I'm here today to introduce our roundtable forum with Max Wilbert. Max is not only a climate activist and a climate organizer, he's also a climate thinker who raises the question, what are we trying to attempt to accomplish with our climate activism? Are we simply trying to green our existing civilization, or are we working towards a much better world? I think you'll find this enjoyable. Thanks for watching.
Let's start with some origin stories. Well, your personal origin story, where you became an activist. Do you have? Was there a point in your life where you quote unquote became radicalized? What led you to take the life path that you're on now?
Well, thanks a lot for having me, guys. It's good to be with you. And I'd be happy to talk a little bit about my background and origin story in this. I really take it back quite a ways. We can go back multiple generations, in fact. I come from a family of people who have been politically active and aware for some time. My grandfather was a conscientious objector and a war resistor who had to defend his beliefs in court and was basically kicked out of his church and his community because he didn't think it was right to go fight in World War II, which obviously the morality around that is pretty challenging. Not as clear cut of a war as something like Vietnam, in terms of the justice and injustice of participating. But nonetheless, he had political beliefs and ethical beliefs that were incredibly important to him, and he was willing to sacrifice for those. And so that was a value that was instilled in my family pretty early on through him. There's this apocryphal story, a true story of my mom skipping school when she was in high school to go to a civil rights march. This must have been in the 60s, and running into her mom, my grandma, at the march.
Wow.
And my grandma later on took the kids out of school and put them into freedom school, which, of course, that was big down in Mississippi. This was up in Seattle, but there was freedom school like activities going on in these different places, educating people about racism and the issues that were going on in the society, that were so important at that time. So I was riding on my dad's shoulders in some protest marches when I was a kid. Before I was born, my parents, and after I was born, my parents were participating, not as leaders, not as major figures, but just as people in anti-apartheid struggles, in critiques of U.S. support and propping up of right-wing dictatorships and military governments and paramilitaries in places like Guatemala and El Salvador and so on. Um, so I was very lucky in that I grew up with Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn on the bookshelf. And so when I started to learn about these issues more at a conscious level, I already had a grounding somewhat just from taking in some of that stuff subconsciously almost as a kid, at hearing these speeches at protests and hearing my parents have conversations with their friends about politics and about the different issues that were happening. So, certainly none of the work that I do and none of the person that I am, um, so much of that is attributable to my family and the community that I grew up in and the people I was around. I certainly don't agree with all the political perspectives that I came from or all the beliefs that that family and community has. There are areas of disagreement and so on, but I do give a lot of credit to that. Another big factor for me was I grew up in Seattle. And so 1999, I was 11 years old when the WTO came to Seattle, and there were the massive protests, 50,000 people on the streets, big nonviolent direct action to shut down the delegates' access to the convention center, to stop them from holding these meetings, to basically partition up the world in this sort of neo-colonial system of globalized capitalism, a new form of colonialism. So I at that time, I was really just getting involved actively in politics myself, getting involved in some youth groups with my sister in Seattle around racism issues. But there was this really vibrant political ferment going on in Seattle at that time, during and after WTO, because you had the labor unions, and you had the environmentalists, and you had the folks from Mexico, the immigrants who were working in solidarity with the Zapatistas, and were really concerned about the impacts of NAFTA and the free trade rules on small farmers and subsistence peoples. You had, anarchists, you had Marxists, you had people, you had the Green Party folks, you had environmental groups. All these different people came together to collaborate against the WTO, recognizing that corporate power is this thing that links all of these different issues. It links environmental destruction, it links exploitation of workers, it links war and the arms trade and the exploitation of people in these types of situations. So so I came of age in that, and once you have that lens that looks at these issues more systematically, holistically, from a big picture, it's really hard to fall down. It makes it more difficult to fall down some of the common rabbit holes and traps that I think I have seen as being so common in, for example, the environmental movement. So we're going to talk about Bright Green Lies and Thacker Pass later, but I think if you have this perspective that brings together these different issues and sees the links between, for example, the exploitation of people and the destruction of nature, then false solutions become a lot easier to spot. So, I fell into the false solution stuff for a while myself when I was in my teens and my early 20s, because that's all that was out there. The environmental movement was, it felt like the environmental movement, at least that I was around, that I could see at that age, was like this very individualist, consumeristic environmental movement that was all about be a vegetarian, ride your bike, reduce your personal consumption, and everyone needs to do that, and that's the path to sustainability. And I think individual change is really important. That's a big factor throughout history with all kinds of social movements, not just because of the direct impacts that it makes, but because it can be powerful symbolically as creating the new world that we wish to see, as part of a broader political movement that's trying to address these issues on a political, social level. So that's kind of all over the place, but I got involved as a radical environmentalist more explicitly. I became radicalized in my early 20s, and I haven't really looked back since then. That was, I'm 35 now, and I've been more or less a full-time organizer on these issues for 15 years, something like that at this point.
Beautiful. That's a great synopsis, great origin story. So what about our predicament? I mean, how do you see our predicament right now? Because of course there's so much conversation about climate change, that seems to take up all the oxygen in the room, and obviously there's a lot more to it than that. So if you were to make a synopsis of the human predicament right now.
Yeah, it's I'm just grabbing my water here. Well, I think predicament is a good term because it's not a problem, in that problems are things that have solutions. And we're not really in a situation that has a solution in the sense of a simple direct path forward that's going to solve all the issues that we're facing. It's a really complex, interrelated predicament. And anyone who studied ecology has come across the term overshoot. Unfortunately, that's a very tiny proportion of the world's population that has studied ecology at all. In my opinion, this stuff should be taught to children starting at a very, very young age. I mean, and throughout most of our history as a species on the planet, children were taught about overshoot and carrying capacity, not using that language, but simply because that's part of survival. You don't overhunt the deer in the forest. You pay attention to how many there are. You don't pick too much of the edible plants because then you won't have any left. Even if you're just a gardener, you know,
Right.
and you're self-sufficient food producer, subsistence, you save some of your seed for planting the next season, right? It's these ideas are very basic and integral to human survival on the planet. So it's shocking to me that overshoot these basic types of ecological terms and understandings are not discussed at all. I mean, that is a taboo topic in the media. You know, climate change is something we can cover and we can talk about a lot these days. I think because it's a topic that can drive a lot of corporate profit. You know, there's a lot of business interests that can monetize that problem in sort of a Naomi Klein shock doctrine type way. You know, we're going to take advantage of this crisis and make a lot of money off of it.
Right.
But overshoot is not quite the same. And so just to define for people who are watching, overshoot is the idea that a given ecosystem or a given, you know, natural community has a carrying capacity of creatures within it. So if you have too many deer living on an island, they'll eat down all the plants that they like to eat, and then they won't have anything to eat eventually, right? If they eat faster than the grass can regrow, then the grass will decline in health. You know, it'll get shorter and shorter. They'll eat it down to the ground, and then eventually they'll probably kill the grass, and then the deer won't have anything to eat and they starve. Um, we're in that situation now globally, but of course, our population is bigger than it's ever been on this planet, 8 billion plus. And that's driven by fossil fuel energy. I mean, most of the nitrogen in our bodies comes directly from fossil fuel fertilizers.
Mhm.
Um, so, you know, people don't like it when you even talk about these issues. It's not really it's a kind of a hot potato topic because people think as soon as you bring up population, number one, you're genocidal, you want to kill people, which I don't want to kill people. I just want to talk about the fact that there are 8 billion people on the planet, and that's probably not sustainable. All the evidence shows it's not sustainable. Um, and two, people want to say that you're racist because there's a long history of people who bring up population issues being racist in the past. There's a history of this. It's a real sordid, nefarious history. It's not nice. Um, I think it's important that we talk about it nonetheless, with the understanding that one, um, as many people who study population issues have said, probably the most overpopulated country on the planet is the United States. If you look at the impact, because population alone isn't impact, it's population times consumption. It's the amount that you consume. So it's something like, you know, the average person in the United States has an impact of like 10 times higher or 20 times higher than somebody living in, say, Burundi or something like that, right? So, and of course, there are people working on population issues all over the world, you know, from all different cultures, from all different backgrounds, who are recognizing that this is an issue, it's serious, and um, and it's one part of the problem. So overshoot is not just looking at population, it's looking at consumption as an essential part of that equation. And it's also looking at the impacts of technology because technology is part of that consumption curve. It's part of this whole equation of impact. In fact, ecologists sometimes use an equation. Uh, it's IPAT. Impact equals population times affluence times technology. And that's our impact on the planet. And so by that measure, people who are living in the wealthiest nations in the world and those who are richest in the world as individuals have the biggest impact. You know, the billionaires in India have a far bigger impact than any of us do, right? Just like the billionaires here have a far bigger impact than us do and have an astronomical impact compared to the average working class or poor person living in, say, the Philippines, where I have a bunch of friends working on these issues, right? Um, so yeah, so overshoot, I think we've dug ourselves into a hole. We've dug ourselves into a hole. And that's why I think the word predicament is an important one, because there's no easy way out of this situation.
Right.
Um, we're all supported by fossil fuels. Most of our food is grown and brought to us and fertilized with fossil fuel energy.
Mhm.
Fossil fuels are destroying the planet alongside all these other issues like deforestation, the direct impact of industrial agriculture, urban sprawl, soil, air, water pollution, et cetera, et cetera. The creation of all these novel chemicals and so on, all these different issues. And we're largely dependent on that system. So it's no surprise to me that we're in this state of kind of political paralysis on the national and international level, because there's no easy way out of this. We've seen people advocating for, we need to switch 100% to renewable energy. We've seen, activists and some scientists talk about this and say it can be done very quickly. We just need to muster the political will. I don't think that's actually true. As someone who thinks global warming is a real crisis, I don't think that's technically possible and feasible right now, given the technology we have, given the amount of energy and resources that we have. It's not really feasible to make this switch so quickly and easily. It's actually very, very, very challenging. And if you guys want, we could talk about the reasons for that, but we talk about that in our book. But part of the other question is, in our book, we say, okay, there are these reasons why that switch is technically challenging. But almost more important is the question of, is that what we really want to do?
Right.
Not that we should stick with fossil fuels, but do we want to even attempt to maintain a high energy, highly consumeristic, globalized technological society that looks like the modern society? And our answer is no. Not because, I'm not naive enough to say that this culture and this way of life has no benefits. I wouldn't be alive, and I'm sure you guys probably wouldn't either, without modern medicine. I mean, I've had to take antibiotics, and I've been in the hospital multiple times in my life, and there are lots of ways in which I'm dependent on this system. But there are, of course, other ways to live. There are many thousands of human cultures that have lived in much simpler, lower energy, closer to the land ways that are far, far more sustainable and ecologically um, sort of integrated. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, and uh, in that way, I think this climate crisis is an opportunity to shift course. It's a mirror, reflecting our way of life, this excess of modernity and all the problems that it has caused back at us, and asking, what are you going to do about it? And right now, the dominant culture is answering, we're just going to keep going. We're going to keep running. We're going to keep building. We're going to keep consuming. We're going to more, 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 more.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of my work is essentially just trying to say, we need to stop. We need to slow down. We need to relocalize. We need to go back to these old ways. Yes, we can keep some of, the best things that have come about from modernity. It's not like we need to throw away, germ theory and go back to the dark ages. But um, the industrial economy that produces smartphones and mass plastics and railroad cars and airliners that can fly across the world in a few hours. This is simply not sustainable. We need to look at this very honestly and with clear eyes and say that this is not sustainable and figure out a better way to do things.
Yeah.
So what does that synopsis tell us about activism right now? I mean, how does the young activist focus their energy? Because the problems are so numerous, and there's a million ways to be an activist. What do you recommend for somebody who might just be getting involved in this? Where should the focus be? And I know you had a conference back in August, and I'm sure that you were talking about these same things. How do you take a young activist and put them on a pathway to be effective and have a meaningful life?
Well, I always say that the first step is to shift our allegiance because, and what I mean by that is that most people, let's say you see a big climate march happening in New York City because there's not really a functional environmental movement anymore in this country, I would say. There's a climate movement. The environmental movement has been turned into a climate movement. Many of them would say they're environmentalists. But say you see this climate march and you go down and you ask people what they're marching for, and they say, we're here to save the planet, right? And then you ask them, what do they want? What are your demands? What are you actually advocating for? And most of them will say, um, we want more wind and solar energy. We want subsidies for electric vehicle production to bring the cost down. We want these sort of government policies to shift funding and national priorities away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy technologies. And what that says to me is that we have a movement, we have an environmental movement that has largely shifted from working to save the planet, the actual planet, as in rivers and mountains and forests and herds of pronghorn antelope and mule deer and white-tailed deer and schools of cod and whales and pigeons and so on, to a movement that is trying to figure out how to sustain modern industrial capitalism. Right.
Right.
So the marchers aren't saying, generally, many of them will say this, but their main demands up front, the messages are generally not stop cutting forests, stop mining the mountains, stop destroying the ocean. You will find protests and movements dedicated to these things, but we're talking about the big marches, the big organizations, the people who are writing big op-eds in the New Yorker and so on, Wall Street Journal. They're not focused much on those issues. They're focused on how do we sustain industrial capitalism.
Right.
And they wouldn't use those words for it. But I think that's sort of this co-opting that's been happening behind the scenes. It's very, very sneaky. And I think a lot of people have slipped into it, not out of any sort of malice or ill intent, but just because it's been a really good marketing campaign. It's been incredibly good for decades now. I mean, I remember being 13 or 12 years old and starting to read about global warming on treehugger.com, which was an early, environmentalist website. And it was like almost every other article was like, new technological breakthrough makes solar panels more efficient, or,
Mhm.
new electric vehicle prototype is so amazing. And, the other half of the articles would be like, here's how to create your own garden, here's how to garden better, or here's how to reduce your carbon footprint in XYZ way. And there was some good content on there. But what I mean to say by that is I'm 35 now. That was over 20 years ago. And that website is still pumping out the exact same content and reaching millions of people every day. And there's a lot of websites like this and a lot of organizations like this. Um, so yeah, so what is the advice to get back to your question, Frank? What's the advice for people, for young people? It's that we need to shift our allegiance to the living planet.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be very clear in our values, because your values are the core of everything. They help you set your strategy, they help you set your goals, they help you decide what specific actions to take right now, today, and for the next 5 years, 10 years, the rest of your life, right? Um, and if your values are subconsciously, or if you've been taught that the environmental movement, the way to save the planet is to get renewable energy technologies in there, your actions are probably going to be pretty different than if your values are fundamentally the way to save the planet is to stop wild places, wild beings from being destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And I think that's really the first thing that I say to people, because I think people might say that's kind of a cop out or it's a subtle change, but I think that really changes everything about your actions. And then it becomes very clear, I've spent a lot of my years as an activist fighting fossil fuels, like blocking coal trains, participating in indigenous pipeline blockades, taking action against fracking, all these types of things. And now, as I've grown older, I've also taken actions against, green energy technologies and projects, because from the perspective of the land, there's not that much difference necessarily between an open pit coal mine and an open pit lithium mine for electric vehicle batteries. The mountain's being destroyed, the water's being poisoned, the birds have nowhere to go. And yeah, there's going to be a lot more carbon emissions from the coal mine, and that's important. We can't ignore that. Like, that really does matter. And the land is still being destroyed, right? It's being destroyed for electric vehicles, which are a consumer good produced, in fact, mass produced by corporations in massive factories that are only accessible to about the richest 1/6 of the world's population, or 1/7 probably. Or less, or far less, really. That's what we're talking about, destroying mountains to create consumer goods for some of the wealthiest people on the planet. And, if you live in the United States, it's something like the numbers are pretty crazy. Like, if you make $50,000 a year, you are in the 1% globally. And like, we in the United States we're so out of touch with the reality of life on this planet, where most people have not even a fraction of the wealth that is common in this country. And we've become used to these luxuries that are just really almost unimaginable to most people on the planet. I'm a poor working class person. I've been below the poverty line for, my entire adult life, basically. And yet I have more energy and material at my beck and call than like an emperor did a few generations ago, literally. Like, I can go on the internet and order almost anything I want and get it shipped to my door tomorrow from halfway around the world. That literally would have been unthinkable, unimaginable magic to people 100 years ago. And now that's just normal, right? And so trying to maintain that system that's fundamentally very energy intensive, very wasteful, that is incredibly unjust and unequal. I was just reading an article yesterday that this was an article in Science magazine, like one of the top 2 scientific journals in the world, that was saying that just the air pollution caused by international trade, it has a disproportionate effect on the poor communities where the resources are exported from to the wealthy countries.
Right.
Just that air pollution causes 700,000 deaths annually from international trade. I mean, that is shocking. That's like a Holocaust every decade.
Yeah.
And it's just the air pollution impacts of international trade. So yeah, there's a lot of inequality, and there's a lot of ecological destruction that's coming out of this system and this way of life. And we don't need to live this way. I mean, I have a good friend who lives 5 miles this way, who runs a little permaculture farm. And if the grid went down tomorrow and the supply chains collapsed, as long as, hungry people didn't overrun her farm, she could feed herself and quite a few others from the land there sustainably, probably in perpetuity. And that doesn't just happen, easily. She's put in a lot of work over many years to make that happen. And, she still does have some outside input. I'm not saying it would be easy to make that sort of transition, but it is possible to live in these much lower energy, more humble, and sustainable ways of life. Of course it is. Most people on this planet have lived that way throughout history.
Right.
We just have to make the choice to do that. And we have to stop the people and the institutions, the corporations who are trying to prevent that from happening.
Nice. John, J-Lo, what do you got?
You're muted, John.
I've got one comment, Max, and then maybe a question for you. I think if we looked at why the environmental movement has become a climate movement, to some extent, I think it's true that the environmental movement, as you say, has been saying the same thing for 30 or 40 years. And as the planet deteriorated, they haven't really changed. In other words, the Sierra Club, for example, remains a club. And while all of these groups perform some good services and some important things, the purpose of the climate movement, to some extent, was to say the species that is at risk is us. It's humans. This isn't an environmental problem. It's a genocidal problem. I mean, it's some rich people and elites are leading all of us to our deaths. It's sort of a bottom line way of saying it. And I agree with you that perhaps people have been captured by the idea of a Green New Deal and that type of thing. But I think a lot of groups are focusing more on other issues. And here's, it sort of leads to the question, assuming that we can't fix a problem, which I think you're absolutely right, it's a predicament. Who should make the decision about what to do next? And what should young activists do to manage that decision? Extinction Rebellion focuses not on a solution, but on a move to try to get citizens' assemblies replacing these bureaucratic, corporate-driven democracies that exist. Do you have any thoughts on what activists can do to affect not so much the solution, but how to agree to effectuate a solution that I think we agree with you would involve personal change, cultural change, economic change, a whole different way of life? How do we go about that?
Yeah, really good points, John, and really good question. I think you're right. And, I try, I'm critical of the climate movement, but I also really want to give credit where credit is due, because when I first started studying and working on these issues 20 years ago, I would bring up climate change, and my parents, who were environmentally aware people very much so by the standards of the day, like probably in the top, 5-10% of most environmentally aware people in the country, would kind of roll their eyes and be like, what, climate change, what are you talking about? Right. And now it's literally on the newspapers every single day. And that is the result of a lot of hard work by a lot of people. And I think that that's incredibly important work. And I think that, as you said, the species at risk is us, that's an important aspect of this issue. I also think that in a way, the climate movement made a Faustian bargain by saying, this is such an important issue. It's such an existential crisis for human beings that we are going to, rather than making this about the environment, the planet as a whole, we're going to focus on human beings, and we're going to try and come up with sort of more populist solutions to this problem that can get some mainstream traction in political parties, in national governments, and so on. That's what's really led to, the climate movement as it currently exists, and as it has manifestations in terms of like the Green New Deal and Biden's climate policies, and what you're seeing in places like Germany and the UK and around the world, where governments are pushing these sort of these capitalistic techno solution, top-down solutions, quote unquote solutions to global warming. I don't think that's what a lot of the grassroots climate activists really want when it comes down to it. But I think it's sort of a Naomi Klein style shock doctrine type situation, seize the moment, right?
Right.
I think that the question that you're asking about, how do we build community and agreement between people in the face of this crisis, knowing that that's an incredibly challenging issue. Of course, it brings up the fact of how polarized this country is, and around the world, how much polarization there is, how much distrust, how much individualism and sort of lack of community there is. I mean, I mentioned earlier the Philippines. I went to the Philippines 3 or 4 years ago and just spent some time there with some organizers. And I was shocked how they could organize a environmental symposium on a local environmental issue in 24 hours and turn out, dozens or 100, 150 people to an event like that, simply because they have a much more functional community. They actually have community
Right.
in a way that doesn't exist in much of the United States in any sort of functional way. Um, and I've seen the same thing in many other places around the world. In France, you have these mass protests when you had these mass protests of people who are already retired when the government tried to raise the age of retirement for younger people. It wouldn't have affected those older people at all. They were already retired. They had it made, but they
Right.
turned out in the streets en masse to try and protect the future of the younger people, protect their right to just exist and have leisure and just be a human being without being defined by working your ass off all the time until you're dead. Um, and mobilizing that in the United States just seems incredibly difficult. So, I want to bow to you and applaud you and the people you're working with for doing that type of work. There's some people around here, I live in Oregon, who've been working on similar sort of community assembly, citizen assembly type work, trying to bring people together and build, I don't know, almost like the town hall,
Right.
traditions of the East Coast and New England. It's try and build some sort of like direct democracy and real community spirit to get stuff done. It seems to me that's going to be incredibly important as, these climate disasters and all these different issues become um they come to our front door, and they walk in uninvited. Um, and I don't know that I have the answer to that. I mean, you're probably better suited to answer the question that you asked than I am. But I have been studying and reading about what people have been doing in different places. Like there's an organization called Cooperation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi,
Mm.
which sort of emerges out of like it kind of some links to Black nationalist traditions of like Marcus Garvey and we need to build our own economic independence, but bringing in sustainability as well. And like we're going to fight against gentrification by putting together community housing trusts, trying to gain control of some of the land in our community, build small sustainable businesses, small businesses at the community level that aren't predicated on growth, but rather on just providing basic services and needs to people in the community at the local level and do it in sustainable ways by growing food and, so on and so forth. And, I think that's a really interesting model. I think it's a beautiful thing. Um, I think that, I wish that the transition town movement had really had a more radical edge and had taken off 10 or 15 years ago when it seemed like that was at its height, because there was this sort of germ of a powerful idea in that movement that communities need to mobilize at the very local level to relocalize food production and get people back into community and out of their cars and onto the land. And we need to be tearing up concrete and replacing it with fruit trees and new varieties that can withstand the temperatures that we're expecting in 30, 40, 50 years, 100 years, not the temperatures we're just seeing right now.
Right.
And really doing that type of work of combining ecological organizing with direct democracy and mutual aid and community building. That seems to me like a very powerful thing. And actually, I've been talking for a while now that I think we need a third party in the United States and elsewhere around the world, a political party that starts campaigning on these types of platforms and starts working to seize power at grassroots and local levels, in all kinds of, whether it's a school board or a soil conservation district or whatever it is. You kind of saw the right wing do this with the Tea Party, and they work to build power from a grassroots level, starting in churches and community centers and school boards and these different places. and have had a major impact on society, much of it negative. But I think, sustainability activists and eco activists really need to think about starting to do the same thing. All these institutions need to be pushing the envelope when it comes to these issues. I often think in my area there are so many dams on the rivers, and I often think if we just got people to run for these like watershed boards that are they're mostly filled with industry people. Often people who run for them are unopposed. Wouldn't necessarily take that much political organizing to actually get into some of these institutions, but to do so in an organized way in the form of a political organization that has concrete goals around sustainability, relocalization, degrowth, challenging infrastructure, removing fossil fuel infrastructure, not just stopping the new stuff, but removing the old stuff, and building alternatives for people. Because, if it just is coming from the top down and people aren't building community to replace your TVs, right? When the electric grid is no longer reliable because we shut down the natural gas power plant because we decided that was no good, then you're just going to get into the realm of backlash. And that's what we've seen so much with like focusing on government policy as the main driver of top-down environmental change, is it just drives backlash. When I think we need a grassroots uprising built on, crossing some of the political boundaries, building alliances, relocalizing, and changing values at a fundamental level. Not easy at all. Like generational work and very challenging work. But I think that that's what some of the best minds in the country and in the world need to be focusing on. And those of us like me who are certainly not the greatest minds.
J-Lo, what do you got?
Well, this is all really cool. And thinking about some of the things you've said, it seems to me that in order to shift our allegiance to a living planet, right, which is important, we're going to have to give up kind of like the magical thinking, the hopium of human supremacy, of unlimited growth capitalism, of techno optimism that we're all going to end up in Star Trek world and have, food free coming out of a machine, that kind of thing. And we're going to have to shift and increase and expand our personal awareness and relationships around ecological empathy, an awareness of cause and effect and impact. Like you mentioned, overshoot. And for those who don't know, you can go on to Google and just Google overshoot PDF, and you can read the whole book for free, and I recommend it. It changed the way I see the world. How do you, what steps or ideas or suggestions do you have for people who are coming into these awarenesses, thinking about their allegiance to a living planet and wanting to help maybe consolidate? What can we put out in front of them like nibbles of cheese to help consolidate an awareness and understanding and identity as someone who is in that frame and stays in that frame, as opposed to the meta of our culture that just wants you to buy more, all that kind of stuff?
That's a really good question, J-Lo. I'm going to laugh every time I say that, probably for a little while. Sorry. But there was an old conservationist, old school guy, John Livingston, who wrote a bunch of books. And one of the things he said was, I'm not going to remember the exact quote, but it was more or less, in all my years of environmentalism, I've never seen that facts and statistics change people's mind. What really changes people's minds is direct experience of the natural world. And that was what he said, was it's direct experience that is so key to this. So when I first became sort of a deep ecologist and a biocentric person and started to transfer my allegiance to the land, I was already somebody who loved to go out for a hike and, go rock climbing or go for a backpack or whatever. We all enjoy. Even people who destroy the planet love to go skiing, right? The CEOs of these fossil fuel companies are all going to Vail and stuff. So we all have this connection to the planet at some level. But somebody gave me the explicit permission. They said, go out and listen to the land and know that the land is speaking, and that's not a metaphor. Like the land is made up of other living beings who are communicating, not in English words, not in sentences, not in the written form, but it is communicating. And if you listen and you are attentive, you can get messages. Those messages may come in different forms. They may come to you in the form of a thought that just appears in your head, or in the form of sort of a scientific understanding of ecology and how an ecosystem is working and functionally relating to itself and to other beings within it and outside of it. It may come in the form of dreams or something sort of unusual that you don't understand. But our conscious minds aren't really able to process everything that we see and everything that's happening around us, everything that is happening. We are taking in so much information when we're outside in nature. We're breathing in smells, we're hearing all these little rustling sounds and the wind in the leaves and the animal over there, and we're feeling the tingling of the hair on our skin, or the wetness of moss on a rock. We're just taking in a huge amount of information. And it's not, ones and zeros. It's not bits on a hard drive. It's analog data, it's analog relational data, And so somebody gave me permission. They said, go out and listen to the land and, go sit by a tree or a river or a mountainside and ask that land, what does it want? Or ask that being, what does it want? What does it want to tell you? What does it want for the future? And so I did that one time when the first time I did this, I was actually at the shopping mall in Bellingham, Washington, the Bellis Fair Mall. And I was with somebody and they had to go get something at a store or whatever. So I was just in the parking lot waiting for them. And I walked back from the car to the back of the parking lot, and there was this just concrete. And then there was a little drainage ditch and a little creek running through there. And it was kind of a little wild edge of the shopping mall with, trees and bushes and shrubs, but, plastic bags and tires and old oil cans in the stream, and pieces of rusting wire and big chunks of concrete from when they were remodeling the parking lot and all that kind of stuff. So it was this place that's like an interface between consumeristic capitalism and something wild, this water that, the stream that has probably been flowing there for thousands, since the last ice age in some form or another. And so I just sat down by that stream and I just sat and listened for a while and was just silent without, I didn't have a smartphone at the time, but without looking at my old school cell phone, without listening to an audiobook or a podcast or anything or writing, I just sat there. And then I just asked the creek. I don't remember whether I did it out loud or in my head, but I don't think that necessarily matters in a case like this, because trees don't have ears in the same form that we have. So just like the communication is going to be difficult or different rather,
Right.
different than what we're accustomed to with people. And I just said, what do you want? And then I just sat there and my imagination started to go to, what did this creek look like before this parking lot was built?
Hmm.
Because that shopping mall was probably only 30, 40 years old or less, maybe even. It probably was not that long ago that creek was running through farmland, and before that through old growth forest. And so I started imagining, rather than, the target behind me, I started imagining 350-foot tall, 8-foot thick Douglas fir trees,
Right.
and herds of elk moving through the meadow, and salmon coming up that stream, and newts and salamanders crawling under the leaf duff. And I can't say that the land gave me an answer in English words like the answer to a test question in school, right? That's not how this works.
Right.
But I asked a question and I received an answer nonetheless. I have an answer to that question. And what that creek wants is to be free of that trash, to be free of the oil and the brake particulates and the ground up tires flowing off the parking lot concrete into it year after year after year. It wants to, hear quiet, because not far from there, the Interstate 5 crosses over that creek, and it's just this constant roar of cars and trucks. And that creek wants to feel salmon swimming up it once again. And this exercise, this practice is something that you can do anywhere at any time. And it's something that I think is really important for helping bring these understandings, listening to the land and biocentrism into our bodies.
Mhm.
Because I really don't think this is like a mystical woo-woo practice of like spiritual connection with the land. You could look at it that way, but in a sense, this is just a science almost. Like
Sure.
this is an understanding of ecological succession and what could happen if a place like that were restored, and what the benefits of that would be to the climate in terms of carbon sequestration, to biodiversity, in terms of the abundance of life, and so on and so on. But to me, this is also just it's a survival trait. You know,
Mhm.
I often say that sustainability is an adaptive trait.
Mhm.
If you are not living in a sustainable way, you will undermine your own ecological foundations and destroy yourself, destroy your culture, destroy your community, destroy your ability to live. That's the path that our society is on right now. It's the path of total collapse. And, you know, the planet's already in a state of collapse, but, you know, humans are sort of skating along at this peak, right? At this peak where it seems like by a lot of measures, things are going swimmingly for human beings. There's more of us than ever. We have more technology than ever before. We're using more energy than ever. We've harnessed all this technological power. And yet, um, the highest point you reach is right before you start going down.
Right.
You know, the
Right.
darkest, yeah.
Right.
And this is what collapse looks like. This is what peak oil looks like. This is what peak resource use and material use looks like. Is it looks like this excess. It looks like this glut. And um, you know, things will change sooner or later. This way of life is not sustainable, which what that means by definition is that it will not last. It's not like sustainability is like this, you know, uh, happiness quotient or some sort of like abstract measure of moral goodness or something. Although I think there is a moral component, it's a very concrete thing. If you're not sustainable, you can't keep doing it. It's not functionally possible. And that's the path that we're on right now. And it's not going to end well if we don't start deliberately doing something about it. You know, there are already millions and millions of climate and ecological refugees around the world. There's already, you know, if you're living in the small island nations, if you're living in Bangladesh, if you're living in Pakistan, I mean, hell, if you're living in the Gulf Coast of the United States, there's large regions of that area that are just seeing outflows of populations because the hurricanes are coming more commonly and stronger than ever before. And those regions are just depopulating because
Right.
they can't really functionally support human communities anymore, and increasingly can't. And that's going to be the case in many places in the West too, as the wildfires and the droughts continue to get worse. You know, we're just going to see people leaving and fleeing these areas. I mean, the migration crisis, the immigration crisis around the world is a refugee crisis in large part, driven by ecological collapse. And so it's not a future state, you know, it's here. It's definitely here right now.
Right. Right.
Well, I have another question that is kind of, you might say, personal, because I'm curious about you and your life, and in particular your body, because you've been engaged in some of these, pretty titanic battles.
Mm.
And do you see your activism as a stressor, or do you see it as something that helps you integrate into a higher state of health, you might say? And I'm sure it's both. So how do you preserve your health and your physical integrity in the face of these big battles that you're fighting?
I love that question, Frank. That's such a that's such a great question coming from you, because I know your background and the work that you do. And you know, I'm somebody who's been a climber and a runner and an outdoor person for a long time, and so I think that there's a relationship there that's often unexplored. I do think that a lot of people look at activism, or more broadly sort of work in general, as sort of an inherently draining and self-destructive process in some ways.
Right.
And I think that it's a dangerous mindset in a way. I think it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in a sense. You know, I try to look at, as you know, you and I have talked about this, Frank. I got really into parkour when I was younger, which is, you know, a teenage boy paradigm for sure. But what's really interesting about parkour to me is that it integrates a lot of martial arts philosophies around the importance of training, preparation, mindset, mental strength and fortitude. It's not just about let's go and huck ourselves off a wall, or, you know, do a flip or something like that. There's some more depth to the ideas that underlie it, similar to a lot of martial arts, where a lot of these practices are looked at as, this is not simply a physical practice, it's almost a spiritual practice. It's certainly a mental practice, but it's a spiritual practice in a sense. And through movement, one can access different states of mind, states of being, states of understanding of self and relationship to self, and challenges, setbacks, accomplishments. You know, they're so that I'm really glad you bring this up, because people don't think in that way. You know, most people look at an athlete or a martial artist or something like that, and they think that person's incredibly talented. You know, I could never do that. That's amazing. What they don't realize is that that person's success is made up of 100,000 small, tiny steps repeated over, you know, 15 or 20 years to get them to the point where they're at. And that it's a very deliberate practice that involves a lot of setbacks, a lot of injuries, you know, a lot of mistakes, a lot of frustrations, a lot of plateaus. And, you know, anyone who's trained any sort of sport will understand these things. And I think the exact same lessons can be applied to activism. You know, that there are times when your energy will wane, when you will have injured yourself and you will need to take a break or change the form that your activity is taking. But you'll also know that if you've trained sport, that every injury is a lesson. Every injury has an incredible lesson for you in it. And every injury is also an opportunity, right? I'll never forget when I sprained my ankle really, really badly, falling from rock climbing. And for the next probably 6 months, I couldn't do a bunch of the normal activities that I did, but I just love movement. I love moving my body. You know, all these different things. So I found different ways. You know, I had to change what I was doing. The form changed, but the core of the activity was still there. And I think that you're probably much better than me, Frank, about putting some of this into words, because I know you've been exploring this relationship between movement and physical practice and exercise or sport, to use some sort of reductive terms, and the relationship between that world and activism for years now. And you've put a lot more thought into that than I have. So maybe you should chime in as well. But yeah, I think the relationship is there, and it's very, very important. And I think the core to it is really looking at it as a practice. Like, I was just reading about Ichiro Suzuki, the baseball player who was the Mariners, you know, star for a long time, big star in Japan, and then he went on from the Mariners. I don't know what team he played for, but amazing player, right? Amazing defensive player, amazing offensive player, just one of the greatest. And most baseball players take the off season off and they rest. They don't play baseball, you know, they go on a vacation, they go golfing, they whatever these multimillionaires do with all their money. But Ichiro would train every day. pretty much year round, every day. I think he said he averaged like 360 training days a year. And it was because he loved the sport. He loved the craft, right? It wasn't, and for someone who's like that, it's not about the championship ring. It's not about the external accomplishment. It's about the relationship between you and your body. And in this case, a baseball and a bat and a glove, right? And physics. It's about understanding your own limits and then trying to figure out how to push them a little bit further. It's about this sort of very subtle relationship. And I think that that's something that you'll find with I've heard that a lot of Olympic athletes, after they go to the Olympics, they get really depressed because they've been training their whole life for, to go to the Olympics and to have this opportunity to compete and da 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 da. And then they go and they do it and they realize that life is exactly the same as it was beforehand, right? Nothing has changed whatsoever. It was just this transient thing that really, in the scheme of things, doesn't matter, And I think as I was reading about Ichiro and reading about these Olympic athletes getting depressed, I was just reflecting on how I think activism is so importantly similar in that, of course, just like a competitive athlete, we care about outcomes. Of course, when we're doing this work, we want to win the campaign. We want to stop the mine. We want to stop the pipeline. We want to defend the forest. We want to win everything that we're doing. And that's not bad at all. That's important that we keep to that. And at the same time, we have to approach this work as a practice, as a daily practice, not as something that is driven by these external markers of success or failure. It has to be driven by our internal sense of integrity and relationship with ourself and our own motivation, our own sense of love and desire to protect and desire to do the right thing. And I think that's to me that has been something that I've been in deep and intimate relationship with over the last couple years with this whole Thacker Pass fight, as we've gone through heartbreak, as the land is being destroyed out there right now, as we put in, basically did everything we could think of short of, open guerrilla warfare and eco-sabotage to stop this mine. Like literally everything besides that we've done, and fail to stop it, to fail to stop this corporate monstrosity, with the support of the federal government and so on, is absolutely heartbreaking. And, it's knocked me down. It's put me on my knees at times and a lot of tears and a lot of exhaustion and burnout and all these different feelings. And yet I come back to that, what I just said, that, this isn't about winning or losing. I mean, I could lose every single fight and every single campaign that I'm involved in for the rest of my life, and I would keep going because that's not what is, that's not the driver for me. Yes, I want to win. Yes, it would be great to win. Yes, I'm heartbroken. And at the same time, this is a practice, and it's a daily practice, and it's not about the championship ring or the trophy. It's about the relationship between, me and the mountain and my integrity, my sense of self.
That's beautifully said. And I thank you for that. There's a lot of wisdom there. John, J-Lo, we got anything else?
No, I thought it was a perfect way to wrap things up. The idea of, we've had other people express it differently, but a daily practice.
Mm-hmm.
We have to measure what we're doing, not by external standards, but by what we believe is best. So very difficult, and it's going to be a very difficult struggle the rest of this year, especially. So,
Absolutely.
J-Lo?
This was fantastic. Thank you for taking the time with us today. I'm really appreciating you.
Well, thanks for having me.
Frank, before we close down, let's reference the book.
Oh, right. Bright green lies. And also, what else? What do you have on the horizon? What are you looking at for this coming year?
Good question. So yeah, if people are interested in my work, they can check out the book Bright Green Lies: How the Environmental Movement Lost Its Way and What We Can Do About It. I have a website, maxwilbert.org. I've got a newsletter on there, which I publish regularly. Um, do a lot of writing and analysis about different issues. Um, a big one for us this year is fighting back on this lawsuit. Myself and 6 other people are being sued by the mining company, Lithium Nevada, uh, because of nonviolent direct action against the Thacker Pass lithium mine. So we are facing this lawsuit. They're probably going to try and get a bunch of money, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars out of us. Obviously, we don't have that money just laying around. Um, so it could kind of financially destroy us. So we've got a big fight on our hands with that. We've got a small legal team working on it, but we're trying to do more fundraising and organizing. We're also collaborating with other allies and starting to organize more across the state because uh, there are more than 21,000 lithium mining claims in the state of Nevada alone. It's a new gold rush happening right now, and something like over 100 proposed or planned lithium mining projects in the Western United States right now. And that's just lithium. We're seeing a boom in mining for all kinds of minerals right now. So these projects pose major threats. We're going to continue to be involved in that, organize as best we can. We're collaborating with the tribes, the alliances we built with the tribes during the Thacker Pass fight to work with them, bring in their traditional knowledge on these issues and work with those communities. I'm pretty concerned as well about offshore wind projects coming into the Pacific Northwest. There's been offshore wind in Europe for many years, in China. They're building it. They're just getting started on the East Coast. But now it's coming to Northern California, the Oregon coast, and the Washington coast. And these projects would be massive, like Empire State Building, tall wind turbines, massive arrays of them out in the ocean, 15, 20, 30 miles offshore in the area of the ocean where the upwelling of the nutrients from deep in the ocean basically drive the entire oceanic food chain on the continental shelf. So these are the real productivity powerhouse zones of the Eastern Pacific. And these, we don't know exactly what all the impacts of these turbines would be because it's still a pretty new technology. But we're talking, again, massive turbines. We're talking giant chains dragging across the seafloor, anchoring these floating turbines, like each chain link as big as a human being. We're talking, transmission stations and substations out in the ocean that would just suck in huge amounts of seawater and superheat it as cooling and then pump it back out into the ocean. Big subsea power transmission cables running back to the shore. Lots and lots of boat trips back and forth for maintenance and repair and so on of these turbines, which all seismic testing, high-powered sonar testing to figure out the geological substrates down in the ocean bottom for the anchoring of these turbines and so on. All this could have pretty serious negative impacts on the ecology. And the Biden administration is trying to fast track all this and push it through with minimal environmental review. So I know the tribes out on the coast are very concerned about this because of potential impacts on salmon and so on. The fishermen are very concerned about it. A lot of grassroots environmentalists are concerned about it. But we know the mainstream environmental groups are not going to fight this. They're not going to challenge this, despite the fact that if it were offshore oil drilling, they would be on it like that. And it's just unfortunate to me. So getting involved in that issue to some extent and continuing to do a lot of writing, organizing, and we'll see what the new year holds. I have something of a vision for what's coming, but you never know. Sometimes there's surprises. So, that's what happened at Thacker Pass a few months before I was out there. I would have had no idea that's what I was going to be doing, but I fell in love with the place, and that's another piece of land that just spoke to me and said, "Look, we need your help."
Mm.
And sometimes you gotta listen, and you gotta answer those calls.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we really want to appreciate you coming on with us and sharing your thoughts. And we look forward to staying in touch on all your various projects. And we're always here to talk. So
Yep.
so let's be in touch.
Well, thanks a lot, guys. I really appreciate you having me on. It's enjoyable conversation, great questions, and I'll look forward to seeing this interview go out and the rest of the series.
Thank you. Thank you again for coming.
Amen.
Thank you for watching today's Activism is Medicine Roundtable Forum. If you'd like to learn more about Max Wilbert, take a look at our webpage we've created on the Activism is Medicine website. And thanks again for coming today.